Hi, I'm Martha Engber, a host of Vigilant Positivity, a blog and podcast meant to decrease polarization by uniting Americans through civil discussion that leads to common ground and action. Thanks to those of you who've tuned in. Please feel free to subscribe and grow the Common Ground movement. Every month, I try to do a citizen spotlight to cast a light on other Americans on both sides of the political spectrum who are working hard to decrease polarization. Today, I'm talking with Ade Salami. Hello, Ade.
Hello, how are you today, Martha?
Very good. Thanks for joining me.
Happy to
Ade
be
Salami
here.
is the program director for pro-democracy political coalitions at Democracy 2076, an organization founded in 2023 working long-term to change our constitution, political culture, and political parties. She was most recently a senior policy aide for two Minneapolis city council members and as a lobbyist at Park Street Public, where she led bipartisan lobbying efforts to move policy and funding appropriations at the state, local, and federal levels. She received her BA from the University of Minnesota. Again, thanks for joining me. As
Happy
I
to be here.
understand it, Democracy 2076 aims to ward off authoritarianism in America. For those of us who only know democracy, what are the signs of authoritarianism?
Of course. I want to first start by slightly reframing that. Democracy 2076 wasn't created to stop authoritarianism necessarily. It was created because there's something in our democracy that feels broken to a lot of people. Like it doesn't feel effective, it doesn't feel responsive, it doesn't feel representative. And when people feel that way, I think that they're more open to strongmen and shortcuts. And so our work really is about helping people imagine and build a democracy that feels like it actually works for them. Because when the gap isn't filled, authoritarianism like fills that space. Like that's what ends up happening. But that being said, I do think that a lot of Americans have actually had like a real world crash course in what authoritarianism looks like. They may not even always call it that. And I think that there's actually a lot of really great scholarship and a pretty well established playbook for it as well. I know that Protect Democracy's authoritarian playbook is one that I refer to when I'm looking at calling out what authoritarianism looks like. And a couple of the things that they name in there is like corrupting elections. And so that looks like attacks on our the legitimacy of our free and fair elections. And you think about things like the big lie, for instance, which made people doubt and question the 2020 election results. I think that's a great example. Quashing dissent or using like state power essentially to kind of like silence criticism. And I think about what happened with Jimmy Kimmel last year as a really good example of that. Or politicizing independent institutions. So looking to make the appointment process I'm thinking of specifically for like leaders of like key institutions like the FBI or the Federal Reserve and making those decisions based on loyalty as opposed to like law or ability. And so I think about President Trump's ongoing fight with Jerome Powell, who's the head of the Fed, or his attacks on James Comey as examples of that. We have scapegoating vulnerable communities, and we're seeing that across the nation with what's happening with ICE right now. And then ICE also like escalating violence, which is also an example of a authoritarianism playbook move of like using violence and normalization of political violence as a way of creating like unrest and that type of disturbance. And then there's obviously like spreading of disinformation and like propaganda. And I think for me, what comes up when I think of that is like going back to COVID and how President Trump was really like the biggest spreader of COVID disinformation at that time. And so I think those are a couple of key ways that authoritarianism shows up and what it looks like.
Well, it's interesting because everything that you mentioned, I'm pretty sure that the Democrats are saying about the Republicans are saying about the Democrats. They are the ones who are corrupting politics. They are the ones who are spreading disinformation and behaving badly. And so, is the idea that authoritarianism can be seen in that description of our polarized country? In other words, that's what authoritarianism does. It pits citizens against one another, and it makes the other side look like the bad person. I mean, is that one of the signs of authoritarianism? I mean, because that's exactly what you get. Whatever we believe about the other side, they believe about us.
I don't
So,
necessarily think that particular thing is part of the authoritarian playbook. I do think it's a side effect. Like it's essentially it's something that comes up because authoritarianism begins to take root. I think the interesting thing to look at when we're reflecting on what it looks like is that authoritarianism doesn't come from just one side or the other. I think in the US, especially like when we look at the last 10 years, there have been a lot of great examples of what it looks like if it comes from the right, but that does not mean that it cannot come from the left, and overlooking that I think is actually concerning.
yes, it's an interesting finger pointing and of course depolarizing that. Your organization is working on that and a lot of other organizations are working on it. But getting beyond the misinformation is a trick. So what is your organization doing in that regard? Anything or just treating it like it is or what?
I would say that I think a lot of our focus is going to be on finding ways to help Americans kind of focus on what it looks like to build connections and relationships and coalitions past what it is that they currently understand about their current political binaries and political realities. I think so much of politics is rooted in a false binary that a lot of the work that I'm working on specifically right now is focusing on disturbing the comfort levels that people have there and broadening their ability to look into unlikely partnerships, for lack of a better word, as a way to build connection and make progress.
Well, your organization also works toward getting Americans to buy into the concept of pro-topian future, as opposed to dystopian. So dystopian, of course, is where everything is bad, and protopian is there's hope. Can you explain that idea and give me your theory about why people might find a protopian future impossible? As well as why we seem to dwell on dystopian futures. I mean, it's like our favorite pastime, if you look at books and TVs and movies.
Of course. And I love those summary definitions that you gave there, like utopia being like perfect, unrealistic, dystopia being like the Handmaid's Tale, right? Like everything is falling apart. And again, like protopia, I like to see of as sitting like in that middle. It's it's a realistic and incremental path of like continuous improvement. And so the idea is that things are getting better, but we're not necessarily at perfect. And the term actually came from Kevin Kelly back in 2009, again, focusing on that idea of like not a fantasy, not a collapse, just a pathway where society becomes like fair and functional and humane. And I would say our goal is not to try to get Americans to buy into the concept of a protopian future, but to co-create that we're not in this nihilistic, like nothing matters sort of mindset. And we're actively working on imagining what that better future could look like and what it would take to get there. And I would say for us, it's not specifically trying to sell people on like what that one specific future might look like. Like we're not saying like here's the destination. I think we're trying to create the space for people, like I had said earlier, across differences to imagine what a better future could look like for them and then actually work towards that better future together. Because when people feels like nothing matters or nothing can change, I think that that's ultimately when they start to disengage. And to answer the second part of your question, I think dystopian futures are easier to imagine because they're basically today, but they're worse. And I think that they're built around conflict and scarcity and winners and losers. And the way our brains work, like we're hardwired to go to that place. And I think that we have that negativity bias kind of built in. And so they feel normal in that way. Like we're always scanning for threats.
Because if we don't pay attention to them, then we could be killed, and that's our animal instinct.
I agree. Yes.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, toward the mission of deterring, I'll say, authoritarianism and promoting an achievable, brighter future, Democracy 2076 has three programs. The first is Imagining 2076, which is what you're talking about, and fostering people's, encouraging people's imaginations. And it works to uh, focus me on media content that shows what a protopian future looks like. The second is pushing for a new constitution that includes some 68 amendments that your past convention delegates determined would shore up democracy in the US, which I think is fascinating, but another show. And thirdly, there's your program, which takes a close look at political coalitions. Can you define what a coalition is, as opposed to just a group or a partnership? And tell us more about the program.
Of course. So when we are saying coalition, like you said, it's not necessarily just a group. We're really talking about like three things. And those three things are who is in it, what is it that they believe, and what really divides them from other groups. So like what are those wedge issues? And I think like when you look at politics, like for instance, if you look at Congress, we already use like that idea and that language all the time. Like we talk about like the Squad or like the Blue Dogs and MAGA and the Tea Party, and those are factions, but in a way, those are also coalitions. And that same thing, I think, exists among voters and organizations and movements. It's not something that just happens with like politics and elected officials. I think what makes this moment different is that the coalitions are shifting. Like they're realigning on those three axes that I shared, and like the people in our political parties and coalitions are changing. The issues that divide our parties are changing. The ideas holding the coalitions together are changing. And I think that that is part of why so many people feel politically disoriented in this moment. And you find yourself agreeing with people that you typically weren't aligned with, that you saw yourself having nothing in common with. And sometimes you end up clashing with people that have been your allies and people that you were always on the same side of something with. And I think that can feel unsettling, but I also think that that's where there's opportunity. And I think when coalitions themselves start to move and like get going, there's so many more possibilities that open up. Like you can see the opportunity to build majorities that didn't previously exist, and you can move legislation that's been stuck for decades and didn't have a path forward before because there's now a group that's willing to coalesce behind a common cause. And
Yeah.
I think like on the flip side of that, like there's risk. And I think that the reason that there's risk there is like some of the changes that we're seeing in our politics are pulling people in a more authoritarian direction. And I think that my program really is about naming what is changing and tracking what new coalitions are arising and could form and get things done. And also watching for where those like democratic norms are starting to break down so we can hopefully like intervene before it's too late.
It's a very interesting thing. As you were talking, what I was thinking about is a political earthquake, is what you're talking about. And it's not just our country, it's global. And when an earthquake occurs, people tend to get very scared by that. And you duck and you take evasive action. And so the tendency then is to want to go to the one person who is like, follow me, I know what to do. And that's, of course, the kind of gist of authoritarianism. I'm going to go to that person who is insisting they know what's going on. But you're also saying that at the same time, there is opportunity. I think that's what people don't see. In other words, things are rolling around and there's a lot of chaos, and they're not seeing that opportunity. So I guess it's people like you who can help show us the opportunity. Is that the idea?
I would think so. And I think that in this moment, the reason that poses to be so effective is like even when you look at voter identification in the last couple of years, like the independent identifying voter has grown exponentially over the last 6 years. And there's so many people who are sharing that they no longer feel aligned with their party, or that they don't feel like they have great options, or like a conversation that often happens is people feel like they're picking between two evils is something that often comes up. And I think your comparison of like an earthquake is interesting, with like authoritarianism kind of emerging as that idea of like the person that can insert themselves and get something done. And again, I just want to call back to the fact that the reason that looks attractive to people is because the system that they currently have, that they're being shepherded through, doesn't seem to work. No one seems to be in charge. No one seems to have a direction. And when that is lacking, you're going to attach yourself to the thing that feels the most sure. And a person that's insisting that they can help you feels the most sure.
Hmm. Really interesting. So, what caught my eye when researching your organization is that your website states American political coalitions realign approximately every 30 years, and that we're living through another such alignment as we've been talking about. What was the last realignment? How long do such realignments typically take? In other words, is it over the course of a year or 10 years or what? And why do they tend to cycle in 30-year increments?
That is a great question. So there's actually a lot of debate amongst political scientists about when the last realignment even was. I think like some of them point to like the 1980s and some to the 1990s, but I think one moment that people use often as a marker is 1994. And they call that moment the Republican Revolution. It's when Republicans took control of Congress for the first time in, I want to say it was 40 years. And they also solidified the South, for instance, as a solid Republican stronghold. And they made cultural and religious issues central to politics in a way that really hadn't been done before at that time. And I think that what is important is that, like, these types of shifts for realignments don't all happen at once. Like, it's not like you wake up one day and everything's different. Like, these things happen slowly over time. And when we're looking in hindsight, it's really obvious. And a big part of my work is kind of asking that question, like, can we actually see these shifts while they're happening and shape them, as opposed to just writing about them in history books, like after they've happened? And then to that timeline question that you were asking, I don't think that the 30-year rhythm is like a magic formula, but my best guess is the reason that's the one is it roughly lines up with like how long a generation is. Like every couple of decades, you get like new voters, and those new voters have new leaders, and they have new experiences, and they're getting into the political arena. And what you start to see there is when you see a change in generation, like that change of leadership happens, and each generation has a different set of values, like they have different music tastes, like all sorts of different experiences. And that leads them also to ultimately their politics being different. And what they care about will change. And like even the culture changes. And I think that eventually the parties have to reorganize around that energy. And I think that that's why those timelines tend to be around that 30-year mark.
Mm. And it's interesting because it's hard to see. People think in terms of coalitions, they think Republicans, Democrat, two-party. And America, because of laws that both Democrats and Republicans have passed over the years, make it almost impossible for a third party to come about. So, how do you change those two main parties? I mean, neither one of them, as far as I can see, I agree with you, neither one seems to pay attention to the people within them, and nobody's happy with them. Granted, you're going to have cheerleaders in both groups, but what do you do about that? People are like, yes, I want the Republicans and Democrats to change. So how do you do that?
You know, I have a lot of ideas. I don't know that I have answers, but like a lot of the things I'm thinking about are, for instance, like how, like I had mentioned earlier, that there's such a high volume now of people that identify as independent voter. And I think about, like, for instance, like open primaries, like the idea of someone having to campaign on a set of issues because they're not guaranteed support just based on party affiliation. And I think a lot about like Mamdani's most recent campaign and how he was able to build a coalition of people based on addressing their needs and what they shared was important to them. I think that we are entering a moment, especially when I look at our younger voters, where the two parties that we have not only don't appeal to them, they don't feel like they represent them. And I think that that is what primes us at this moment for being at the intersection that makes a realignment possible. Like, I don't believe that it's going to be realistic to assume that this current shuffling is going to be the one that will continue to sustain. We're already at a point where we've seen pretty clearly that it's not. And I think that that in itself is a message, but continuing down that path and looking at like what the future could hold, like I wouldn't be surprised to see possibly like a multi-party future. I think that's something that would be awesome. I wouldn't be surprised for people to say that they don't call themselves any party anymore. They just vote based on issue. Like I think all of these things are possibilities.
Very interesting. Um, very interesting because I consider myself independent now, and I also believe in the common ground movement. People who are all the middle of America, the entire 80% of us who are not happy with either party, and who want to come together on common ground. So it's going to be very interesting. Now, can you explain more about your strategic foresight cohort of 14 leaders? Who are they? What political parties do they represent? And why did you actively seek people from a broad range of viewpoints?
That is a great question. So, the Foresight cohort is a group of people that really helped us write and stress test the research that is in our report. And what we were trying to understand there is what kind of political realignment we're actually living through right now. And there's a ton of great writing out there about different voter groups, right? Like we see a lot of writing about Latino voters or college educated voters. And by the time that a lot of these things are showing up for people to like write those books or a report, it's been happening for years. And we wanted something that was closer to like real time. And so the question that we were asking ourselves is like, who is actually constantly in contact with large numbers of people right now and who are seeing shifts before they're showing up in the polls and the headlines? And that led us essentially to like people who are leaders of big membership-based organizations, like people who are working with communities that are cross-ideological, like different regions, different identities. And we're also like in a very different time in a media environment like than we used to be. I think that political beliefs used to be shaped in a very top-down fashion. I don't think that that's how they work anymore. Like now people's political beliefs are shaped by like social media or YouTube or WhatsApp groups and TikToks. And like you can't just read the New York Times and say that you know what people think. And I think that that's the reason we wanted to bring those people together and track those different communities, like Jewish voters, Asian voters, rural voters, urban voters, people who are watching extremism, like those are all Americans and they're all part of the coalitions that are forming in this moment. And they're ultimately the ones who are going to shape what our parties look like over the next few decades. So, like, we didn't want to look for pundits. We didn't want to look for people who have a very set idea of how things would work and would want to impose that on people. We wanted to be intentional about looking for people who are in their communities, are talking to their neighbors, are seeing things change and shift for their neighbors in real time.
And I think it is worthwhile to go back and say that you're saying that political viewpoints were formed from the top down. What that means is there were three networks on TV, and they would say certain things, and then it funnels down to the viewer. And
Exactly.
newspapers, I think the same thing. But here, with social media, anybody could be at the bottom pushing a message upward. That's correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. 100%. Like you can go on TikTok today, a video has gone viral, it's got 4.1 million views, and you've never seen that person before in your life.
And the person might not even be American, which is, I understand what is going on now for both political parties that they hire people elsewhere to outsource messaging. Hmm, very interesting. On your org's website, I meant to ask about the report. You mentioned a report. What report are you referring to so I don't get it wrong?
Yes, so there are reports for all of our programs, but the one I am referencing is the inaugural report for the Pro-Democracy Political Coalitions in 2076 program. And so it was just released in November of 2025, and it is available on our website under the Coalitions in 2076 page.
Great. We'll be sure to put a link on that. So also on the website, I was fascinated by the five scenarios about how political parties might realign over the next 30 years. Can you explain those scenarios and how your organization might be able to help stimulate democracy, even if both parties are authoritarian, which is one of the scenarios, which I thought was fascinating? Tell us.
Of Yes, of course. So I think to start, just like when we're doing this work, I think something that we hear a lot is like, for instance, I'm thinking of like fundraising grant cycles and how those happen in 2 years, and elections and how those like usually happen every 4 years. But when you're thinking about like changes to democracy or like authoritarianism or party realignments, like that's measured in decades. Like that doesn't happen in such a short time period. And so it's really hard to know if you're actually making progress. And I think that like even if you look at our current political environment nationally, like Donald Trump came to power in 2016, and then in the 2020 election, Joe Biden won. And then in 2024, Donald Trump won again. And that can be kind of confusing to understand because you're looking at it and you're like, does this mean that like Americans want authoritarianism? Is that what they're looking for? And are they supporting it more now than they did in 2016? And like, how do we make sense of that? And I think if we understand that progress itself isn't linear and there's some backsliding, which we do know because that's how it's happened with authoritarianism, like even globally, is that progress towards democracy isn't linear and that there's going to be like backsliding into authoritarianism. It's like a push and a pull between democracy and authoritarianism. I think it's helpful to know that that is what it's going to look like so that we can understand that we are in an information environment that like the chaos that is happening doesn't necessarily reflect that there's not progress happening at the same time.
Oh,
And so the scenarios themselves, like when we built them, they were designed to help us look at like the next 30 years and what the evolution of parties could look like in that next 30 years. And in those five scenarios, like you had shared, there's one where each party is authoritarian, and then there's one where each party is pro-democracy, and then there's also a fifth one where there's like a multi-party block. And I think that a scenario like we had mentioned one where each party is authoritarianism, like that is not a scenario that we would want to see happen. Like the goal would actually be not to figure out which one of these is most likely, but like understand like these are all the possibilities. There are some that we clearly don't want. And how can we handle those challenges and intervene so that we can make sure that we can create really effective stopgaps? And I think that there's like,
so just don't wait. Is that the idea? Don't
well,
wait
yes.
to find out.
Yes, and like I think that there's been a lot of focus on like just the authoritarian part right now, and especially like focusing on the right. But the risk there is, like I've said earlier, that like you could have left-wing authoritarianism and that could start to bubble up, and people aren't paying attention to that right now. And so like when we look at that scenario, like it was important for us to put that out there because we saw it as something that was being overlooked, but it's absolutely a possible future. And I think that that understanding of it being a possibility is the reason that we wanted to make sure we had these different scenarios. Your second question, I think, was how we can help to stimulate democracy, even if both sides are authoritarianism,
Right.
right?
Yes, correct.
And I would say that's actually not how we're thinking about using the scenarios. And I would go back to what I had said before about like, we would want to figure out how to avoid that. That is something we'd want to stop. And we'd want to figure out like, what are the steps? What are the warning signs that we would be able to look for to know if we're headed in that direction so that we can prevent it before it happens. And so the reason that like they're so forward looking and there's that 30 years out is not so that we can be prepared for them when they happen, but that we can look at today and determine which direction we're likely headed up in. And if it's one that we like, we can take steps to make sure that we stay there. And if it's one that we don't, we can take steps to intervene.
What are the steps to intervene, though? I'm curious about that point. So you're looking at it, you're talking with people to see how things are aligning. And so, what does intervention look like? We currently do have laws in place that are decreasing the opportunity to change our government. They're greatly expanding the role of the president, the powers of the president. And as I have mentioned before, they already greatly deter third parties. So what kind of intervention are you thinking about? What does it look like to me, the average American?
That's a great question. I think that what it looks like is understanding that like these aren't big things that are happening and that are like larger than each one of us. Like there are individual actions that I can take today as an individual that will likely have an impact that either shore up a defense or deteriorate a defense. And it's up to me to make one, hopefully that is well informed. In each of our scenarios, like we were very diligent in creating like what we believed those signposts were about things that we are looking at right now that make it apparent that we're heading towards that direction, or things that we might anticipate seeing that show us that we're heading in that direction. And a lot of the solutions and recommendations that we offered as well are showing that it's possible to have like smaller groups make bigger influences. And so we made recommendations based on like people's field. We made recommendations for local government. We made recommendations for like food shelves. And like there's places where each of these sectors of society can influence and step in and have a say. And I think it's important for everyday Americans to understand that because I think So I'll use the analogy of like, for instance, like you start the top of a year, right? It's January and we're like a New Year's resolution, right? A lot of people will use weight loss as a New Year's resolution. And like the idea of like losing a ton of weight can be very daunting. And so like if someone's New Year's resolution is like lose 50 pounds, like you hear that and you're probably like, I don't know if I can do that. But if you look at it as a smaller step that we know can get you to that end goal, it feels more achievable. And so if I'm not saying like lose 50 pounds, but I'm saying, hey, maybe we can start with walking 5,000 steps every day and let's see where
Um,
that gets us.
Great. There are a lot of really good ideas. I've talked with people and people have a lot of really good ideas. But as you know, we live in a place where the noise is so high, getting good ideas out. So, what does it look like for your organization to say, okay, here's our great ideas, and I want to get those ideas out into the public to people like me. Are you working with is that the coalition building part where you're going to disseminate, have these people methodically or the groups methodically send out these messages, these ideas via social media? How do you disperse your ideas? How do you get
That's a
them?
great question. I think that it's less about me dispersing what our ideas are, and I think more about us focusing on people who want to collaborate on making effective change to ensure a representative and responsive democracy, and figuring out if we have tools or information that we believe might serve them in that purpose. And so, for instance, I think of like our scenarios work, and it's like maybe there's not organizations that are looking 50 years into the future, right? But there are organizations that have identified issues that are important to them that are coming up and maybe helping them understand that there's small things that they can do today, that their membership can do today, that individuals can do today that will have that long-term impact is something that they're interested in doing, and we're happy to help them on that journey.
I think people are definitely looking for it. I think it gets confusing about where to actually look. And so I think that's an interesting idea. I'm as I had told you before, I'm a member of Braver Angels, which is of course in this realm and sphere, and just getting ideas out is a big deal. Tough to do.
100%. And I would say, like, I think Braver Angels is a perfect example, right? Like, so much of the work that they do in community is often about helping people bridge across difference and disagreement. And I think that, like, what would be interesting is to have people have conversations on issues that aren't politicized yet. Like a lot of the issues that we have introduced in our 17 spectra are issues that right now on our current political binary, someone on either side of the aisle could be on the same side of one of these spectra. And I think introducing these concepts to people and encouraging them to have conversations across that difference is ultimately the first step.
Very interesting. I definitely think people are very interested in knowing what can I do right now today. And so very interesting. Your organization has created an interactive tool that can tell people like me how we fall on 17 emerging wedge issues, which for those who may not know, a wedge issue can be described as a natural division that's then exploited by political parties to purposely divide Americans. An example of a wedge issue, for example, is do you see, and these are on your website, for example, it asks you, do you see education as a social equalizer or as a status enforcer? Another one. Do you fall more toward identity-centered politics versus issue-centered politics? Third one, do you tend toward gender role traditionalism or gender role fluidity? Who came up with that idea?
So we had the idea to do this interactive tool because we're actually really like taken with what More in Common's perception gap research was doing. And it shows that people tend to think that people of like opposing political parties think about things much more similarly or differently than they tend to think. And so they're over sensationalizing what their opposition likely thinks of them. And the fact that we tend to think that people of the opposing political view hold views that are so much more different from us than they actually do is where it became interesting to us to kind of look at these emerging wedge issues and see where we might be making like assumptions about what people who align with us might think and people who are different than what we believe might think. And I think it was also just an interesting way for us to actually like demonstrate to people that like, hey, like some of your beliefs are actually different than other Republicans, or some of your beliefs are actually different than other Democrats. And we started wondering, like, what would happen if we applied that insight to these emerging wedge issues? And a lot of us assume that, like, everyone in like our party agrees with us on things like education or identity or gender, but that's often not true. And I think that some of the biggest disagreements that you might have will actually be with people that are often like in your own camp, like on your own side. And I think that we thought it would be really powerful to let people see that for themselves. Like to have that realization of like, oh, I'm actually not as aligned as I thought with my party. Or, oh, I have unexpected things in common with people across the aisle. And I think like one of the pieces of feedback that we got was that like a lot of these wedge issues that we have in our spectra, like they felt like false binaries. And I think honestly, that's kind of the point. I think that all political divides are simplified into binaries and we're just used to what the old ones were. And I think that this tool really helps people see that like a lot of the lines that we fight over are constructed and the real picture is a lot more complicated and nuanced.
I do think, and I've done programs before where been talking with people about not only their perception, it's a perception gap is what you're talking about, where another person, you're perceiving them as just completely evil. And of course, they think you're very evil, but when you really talk about issues, you're probably fairly close in terms of belief.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's rather crazy. It's crazy to see it. Does it have a scale in which it says, oh, if you are your number is more toward independent, your number, your whatever your score is for this questionnaire, you're more toward Republican, or does it have anything like that? I
So
didn't.
what it has is we created a prompt for a GPT tool that gives a response to a respondent based on what they submit. And so you can fill it out for as many of the spectra or as few of the spectra as you would like. And then it asks you a few demographic questions like your current political party affiliation, your gender, your age, education. And the GPT's prompt then looks at your responses and then looks at like the feedback that it's gotten from other respondents that have had similar demographic information to you and says, great, like based on this demographic information, here's where you line up with these people. Like you said that you were a Democrat, like you filled out this questionnaire for all 17 spectra and you actually only agree with Democrats on nine. The other like eight are things that you do not see eye to eye with other Democrats on. And I think that that insight and that like tool has been something that has been impactful for people is just to have that knowledge. I'm thinking of folks that I know that submitted it, that looked at it and they're like, I was so confident that me and the Republicans were in lockstep, and it told me that I agreed on only half of the issues. And I think that
Uh,
opening that conversation is interesting, and like that way of us doing it hopefully has been really beneficial to the folks that have managed to take that survey.
I did take the survey because people love surveys, oh, we got a survey. I got to find out how do I stand. So it was really fun. So if you haven't done it, go to their website and give it a try. And I guess what I wanted to ask is, how worried are you about authoritarianism?
That is the million dollar question, isn't it? Uh, I would say I'm probably the most worried I've ever been, but I'm not fatalistic. And I think that some of that is that a lot more people see what's happening. Like I'm thinking about in 2016 when people were first having the conversations around authoritarianism and it felt like it was alarmist. And that doesn't really happen anymore. Like you're seeing it in how people are talking about like really niche policy stuff like the War Powers Act are now part of like public conversation. You see it here in Minneapolis, like how people are responding to ICE with what happened with Renee Good and the protests and the pushback. So I am worried about what our government is doing. And at the same time, I'm more encouraged than I think I've ever been by how aware and engaged the public is. And I think that people aren't just watching anymore, like they're responding and they're engaging. And I think that's important.
So you're saying this earthquake that we're going through is essentially forcing people to do what they have not done and be more civically minded. more civically engaged, more knowledgeable. It's just forcing things. Everybody knows about misinformation, correct? Whereas we were never talking about that, even 8, 10 years ago. So very interesting. So it's forcing
Right.
us.
Or like even that
Get
people are now
smart.
like there's a lot that they don't understand and they're not content to just be told not to worry about it. Like they want to know more. They're hungry to have that information so that they can understand why it's happening because maybe they don't like it. Maybe they think that something different could work, but they need to understand what we have before they can do that.
Mm. Well, what would you like to see in the future? And what gives you hope that we'll get there? So those are the
Uh,
things. You're just go for it. What's your
what I want for the future is a democracy where it's normal to disagree. And where we actually like expect to persuade each other as opposed to like trying to rig the system so that it to like one side always wins. I think that an important concept that has been lost in politics is that our visions of the future don't have to match. Like the whole point of democracy is that they don't. Like we're not arguing about how to survive. Like we're arguing about what kind of life we want. And not just if our basic needs are met, but like whether we have a little extra. Like I think about how I call myself, like I refer to myself now as like a refined non-alcoholic champagne socialist because fundamentally, like I want everyone to have their basic needs met, but like also have your basic needs met and maybe you want to buy something pretty or like maybe you want to get guac at Chipotle. And I think that that's normal. And I think that what gives me hope for that is that there's new coalitions that are already starting to form about things that most Americans actually agree on. Like most Americans want control over our bodies. Most Americans want leaders who understand our struggles. We want freedom from religious persecution. We want to trust the news. We want responsible leadership. Like people might come at those things from different places, but they're shared ideals. Like those are shared outcomes that we have in common. And I don't think that people who support President Trump are there for authoritarianism. I think that they're actually there for change. Like they know the system is broken, just like people that don't support Donald Trump. And we just disagree on like why and how we can fix it. And I think another thing that makes me hopeful is like candidates that actually speak to that brokenness and offer concrete ways to improve people's lives. Like again, I'm thinking of Mayor Mamdani's recent election and his campaign and being able to offer those solutions to voters, like voters will respond to that even if the candidates themselves seem imperfect. And there's so many more 2025 elections where we saw that happen, where people were voting for different kinds of leaders than they typically did because they were so hungry for something to shift and to look different. And I think that the fact that there's so many people from any side of any political spectrum that we have that are saying like this isn't working, we need to do something different, makes me optimistic. Like that realization and recognition is that we do have a collective affirmative vision. And I think that that is the first step.
wonderful? Great. I am all for hope. So thanks for coming and giving us some and for explaining how your organization is going about doing that. So that's wonderful. And thanks again to those of you who listened to the episode. You can find a post and a transcript of today's interview on my blog, vigilantpositivity.wordpress.com. Please join our cause. Thanks, Ade.
Thank you, Martha.